It was 4:58 in the morning in Minneapolis, Minnesota. 8 kilograms of pink cocaine and heroin were present. A government minister found himself in shackles. A headmaster of a school was fleeing the scene. Brutality was concealed underneath stacks of documents. The ensuing events revealed the way schooling was turned into a tool to transport narcotics, arms, and criminality within the infrastructure. Allow me to demonstrate this to you. A deadly emergency is tormenting neighborhoods and ruining existences from one shore to the other. Throughout the last several weeks, we have investigated the reasons the fatality count is rising and the fundamental sources of this countrywide issue. This evening, we analyze precisely the manner in which fentanyl is truly entering the populace. At 6 o'clock in the morning within Minneapolis, Minnesota, moments past sunrise, over 120 federal operatives encircled a state facility that was never intended to become a locus of criminal activity. Squads from the FBI and DEA advanced simultaneously. There were no declarations and no bargaining took place. The entrances were breached forcefully. Within the workspace of Marion Alley Gullett, the 42-year-old Secretary of Education for Minnesota, the agents encountered turmoil, yelling, and hysteria. Files were being destroyed as the events unfolded. A short yet aggressive physical confrontation broke out. Workstations were overturned and storage units pried apart as armed units pressed ahead through every chamber until opposition fell apart and the structure fell quiet. What the detectives discovered shocked even the most experienced operatives. 8 kilograms of pink cocaine, heroin bundled for quick sale, numerous guns, and delivery logs stamped with CJNG cartel ciphers were present. These items were not concealed within a cellar or transported via rear laneways. Everything was kept plainly within a state administrative room. Marion Alley Ghoul was arrested immediately at the scene. A high-ranking executive now stood charged with managing a narcotics enterprise from the heart of civic power. This situation was not merely graft. It represented a conflict concealed by bureaucracy. The scene you recently witnessed was merely the exterior. The following events clarify the reasons. Please type, inside job, if you think this did not originate as an external danger. Let us go back 3 months in time. A locally hired educator disappeared. There was no farewell given. There was no formal letter of resignation. One particular morning the lights in his teaching room remained dark. By the time evening fell his telephone had gone mute. His relatives were unable to contact him. The facts that detectives subsequently revealed were significantly more alarming. During the days preceding his vanishing, the instructor had opened sensitive school documents linked to top-tier authorizations. These were archives that were never intended for instructional personnel. He had highlighted certain irregularities. Specific names were listed double. Calendar dates did not align correctly. Cargo deliveries were recorded in places where pupils ought to have been located. Safety records indicated his entry card was utilized past midnight within an office section that ought to have been vacant. Video surveillance recorded him departing broadly alone while holding a slender binder close against his torso. He never arrived at his residence. Several days afterward, his corpse was discovered within a locked storage depot close to the harbor. There were no indications of theft. This event was not haphazard brutality. The wounds were exact and deliberate, intended to deliver a caution. Detectives arrived at a terrifying deduction. He was not murdered because of his actions. He was murdered because of his findings. Starting from that instant, the investigation was no longer concerning an absent educator. It transformed into an issue regarding a regime prepared to eliminate anybody who posed the incorrect inquiries. If you are convinced this extends past a single person, please press like and write, system. By the time detectives linked the slain instructor to confidential school files, the inquiry moved into a much grimmer phase. This was not merely regarding one bureaucrat misusing authority. What was revealed was a narcotics supply network intentionally planted within civic organizations, constructed to transport drugs silently and without being noticed. Researchers followed 47 distinct internal endorsements connected to that identical sequence of autographs. Various divisions and separate bureaus always produced the identical result. Documents traveled more quickly than usual. Mandatory assessments were bypassed completely. Warning signals were turned off by hand. Over $18 million designated as school supply financing was diverted via phantom companies that were real only on documents. The funds did not simply vanish. Cash was utilized to transport cocaine, heroin, and artificial narcotics along fixed routes connected straight to the CJNG syndicate. The hierarchy was stratified on purpose. Located at the summit were executives who authorized maneuvers without examination, shielded by procedure and power. Beneath them were workers, scribes, organizers, and information managers who changed schedules, copied identities, and silently dismissed digital alarms. External to the bureaus were middlemen, freight agents, harbor contacts, and alleged advisors compensated to transport narcotic loads under the guise of valid documentation. Detectives pinpointed 23 current conspirators spanning schooling, medical services, and harbor management. 9 possessed spotless records and current security vetting. 6 individuals possessed no record of crime whatsoever. That was the intentional plan. The web depended upon individuals who appeared normal rather than hazardous. The most unsettling revelation originated from the intersection of data. Records of narcotic overdoses corresponded with student relocations. Absences in attendance coordinated with delivery timeframes. Identities deleted from logs subsequently showed up in the archives of the medical examiner. Statistically, a fluke was out of the question. The narcotics were transported initially. Documentation shielded the movement. Brute force was utilized only when quietness was unsuccessful. The deduction was inevitable. The structure itself had been transformed into an instrument of harm. Please like and distribute this clip if you think the populace has a right to witness the true depth of this matter. The command was given prior to daybreak. There was no media presence and there were no alerts. A single order traveled via encrypted lines. Proceed immediately. In a matter of moments, the mission grew well past Minneapolis. This event was no longer merely a detention. It became a synchronized attack on multiple locations throughout the province. Over 900 federal staff members were stationed throughout Minnesota. The FBI, DEA, and information squads advanced in orchestrated quietness. Vehicle columns divided toward scores of objectives simultaneously. Planes took off from local airfields. Special units moved on state bureaus, holding depots, distribution centers, and harbor-side storage units that had functioned for years devoid of inspection. The habit that shielded the web was on the verge of crumbling. At 6:41 in the morning, operatives stopped Hassan Abed Rahman Warsam, aged 29, at the Minneapolis St. Paul International Airport. He was beyond the checkpoint with his flight ticket in his grasp. He never arrived at the departure door. Officers halted him upon the boarding ramp. There was no fleeing and no bewilderment. The primary organizer was under arrest. Simultaneously, entrances were forced open throughout the territory. 17 sites across 6 distinct counties were struck inside a 90-minute timeframe. In one municipality, officers confiscated secured telephones that were still hot from recent usage. In a different location, a depot exposed hidden stockpiles of arms and narcotic wrapping supplies camouflaged as educational provisions. At an office complex in the suburbs, computer drives were seized during a transfer, with information halted before deletion was possible. In the harbor installations, freight records connected straight to CJNG paths were captured. This situation was not pandemonium. This operation was rigorous order. Each squad acted with intent. Every objective had been confirmed 2 times. Opposition was countered with restraint rather than carelessness. Operatives emptied chambers, protected proof, isolated detainees, and saved lives. This marked the distinction between brutality and legitimacy, between lawbreakers and experts. By 10:30 in the morning, the magnitude was irrefutable. 68 individuals were held in custody. 12,000 electronic documents were confiscated. Numerous delivery paths connected to CJNG were closed down in one morning. For many years, the syndicate depended on confidentiality and quiet. It assumed that bureaucracy could survive longer than the law. That assumption was incorrect. This action was not vengeance. This action was responsibility. The government did not succumb to fear. It rose to the occasion. And for the initial time, those concealing themselves behind power realized the reality. The United States does not yield its organizations. It reclaims them. While the strikes occurred, Detectives started gathering the most important elements. It was not the confiscations nor the detentions, but the destruction remaining in the wake. The proof no longer existed solely in storage bays and computer systems. It existed within health dossiers, academic logs, and certificates of death. When those strata were synchronized, the design became impossible to disregard. Across a span of 4 years, researchers pinpointed at least 61 fatalities from overdose linked to that identical supply route. The casualties were not anonymous numbers. They were adolescents, employed fathers and mothers, and aged guardians, individuals whose existences crossed paths with organizations intended to guard them. Trauma center registers displayed increases on particular calendar days. Student presence logs displayed truancies that corresponded with those identical timeframes. The scheduling was precise. The intersection was intentional. The narcotics traveled silently, wrapped to appear normal, and sent through avenues nobody doubted. When a person fell ill, it was dismissed as a misfortune. When a household inquired why their offspring's health chart had been modified or held back, the investigation halted. The infrastructure soaked up the impact and continued forward. That was its power and its ruthlessness. Brutality appeared only when quietness did not work. Detectives connected 9 questionable fatalities to persons who had voiced worries or opened restricted dossiers. None displayed indications of theft. None matched the templates of haphazard criminality. The wounds were uniform, effective, and terminal. Communications were delivered without speech. Individuals discovered rapidly the price of inquisitiveness. The most unsettling find arrived from comparing school lists with reports from the coroner. Multiple casualties possessed immediate links to academies managed by Hassan Abdul Rahman Warsami. Some were pupils who were moved suddenly. Others were guardians who disputed bureaucratic rulings. A handful were employees who observed errors and declined to give approval. Their names showed up one time in academic archives and a second time in infirmary logs. That occurrence was not a fluke. It was managed. Conversations with local residents uncovered an atmosphere of terror that had remained undocumented. Educators talked about the compulsion to endorse modifications without examination. Medical staff remembered orders to postpone notifications. Managers detailed cautions given softly, never in written form. No menaces were required. Everybody comprehended the regulations. Continue forward. Do not gaze behind you. This was the manner in which the web persisted. It was not by saturating roads with shooting, but by controlling results, by choosing which inquiries were resolved and which individuals vanished. Documentation took the place of threats. Power took the place of strength. And when power was unsuccessful, brutality brought back the discipline. Federal squads recorded hundreds of modified documents, scores of faked endorsements, and millions in capital diverted under valid titles. Every alteration appeared minor. Collectively, they created an engine that nourished dependency and deleted responsibility. The deduction was bleak. The harm was not restricted to locations of crime or halls of justice. It was calculated in vacant study tables, infirmary cots, and burial sites. Neighborhoods had borne the cost while trusting the infrastructure was functioning. At present, the infrastructure was laid bare, and for the households remaining, the inquiry provided something they had not received previously: validation. Their bereavements were no longer solitary misfortunes. They were proof. And proof, once viewed distinctly, does not vanish. The matter had advanced past detentions. It had transformed into a judgment day, with the societal effect exposed. Detectives looked internally. What they discovered was not a path of errors but a blueprint. The web did not endure by accident. It endured because the infrastructure itself had been remolded silently, lawfully, and bit by bit to defend it. Verification squads rebuilt the operational process. Throughout 30 months, standard protections were diluted via regulatory changes that appeared benign in writing. Assessment limits were increased. Mutual verifications were delegated elsewhere. Notifications were changed into hand-operated checks. Every modification needed an autograph. Every autograph originated from a separate workstation. Not one individual possessed the entire view. That was the objective. The chain of command was distinct. Executives supplied protection at the summit, permitting exceptions, endorsing timetables, and allowing fast-tracked processing under the guise of scholastic or civic benefit. Beneath them, staff members carried out the technicalities, changing days, copying identities, shutting down warnings, and diverting dossiers so inquiries expired in waiting lists. On the fringes operated middlemen, private agents, and dealers who converted permissions into action, moving parcels and funds without ever contacting the central bureaus. Detectives listed 112 altered files connected to the identical authorization reasoning. In 19 instances, 2 separate divisions endorsed the identical task within moments of one another. This is an impossibility absent of synchronization. Monetary audits uncovered $26.4 million distributed among suppliers that possessed common locations, telephone digits, or tax accountants. The suppliers charged for tasks that appeared valid. The shipments were everything except that. Questioning verified what the statistics implied. Numerous contributors did not view themselves as felons. They thought they were carrying out confidential orders. Some were informed the task pertained to state safety. Others were cautioned that lagging behind could hurt minors or disrupt federal alliances. The vocabulary was selected with precision. Compliance was presented as duty. When opposition arose, it was nullified without drama. Tasks were altered. Entry rights were paused. Professions stagnated. And when a person declined to obey, when inquiries continued past mere annoyance, the stress increased, dossiers disappeared, and grievances were sent elsewhere. In a handful of instances, brutality bridged the divide where power was unsuccessful. The most serious discovery originated from chronological study. The web did not take shape following a single hiring or vote. It expanded, adjusting to inspections, gaining knowledge from close calls, and improving its techniques. Every rotation rendered it more silent, more secure, and more difficult to spot. By the moment narcotics traveled through academies, harbors, and health centers with the identical documentation, the infrastructure no longer identified the danger as alien, it identified it as standard procedure. The federal reaction changed to match this. This effort was not regarding expelling evil participants and proceeding forward. It was regarding taking back the procedures. Entry restrictions were locked down. External assessments took the place of internal approvals. Information flows were copied to stop silent modifications. Reporter avenues were broadened and defended by law. For the initial occasion, the apparatus encountered inspection matching its complexity. Detentions went on, yet the focus shifted. Every arrest was coupled with a procedural correction. Every confiscation sparked a regulatory overturn. The objective was not velocity. It was durability. The deduction was inescapable and profoundly disturbing. Graft had not slid through the fissures. It had been inscribed into the operational process. Taking apart the web required more than shackles. It required reconstructing faith where documentation had superseded discernment and guaranteeing that no infrastructure, regardless of how normal it appears, could ever be transformed into an instrument of harm again. When the inquiry entered its open stage, the repercussions shifted from legal chambers into the sphere of governance. Sessions were planned, declarations were written, and a matter that started with narcotics and homicide turned into a countrywide debate regarding confidence, management, and migration protocol. Voted representatives insisted on responses. How was a top-ranking scholastic chief able to run a felonious web without discovery? How did personal history reviews, inspections, and social defenses malfunction so utterly? Panels summoned testimonies, while examiners broadly published temporary results. The signal from the national command was calculated yet strong. This situation was a breakdown of structures rather than mottos, and it necessitated structural restoration. Simultaneously, the lawsuit sparked a fierce argument concerning Somali migration and integration initiatives. Certain observers hurried to form sweeping deductions. Others cautioned against group condemnation. Neighborhood chiefs talked openly, requesting peace and distinctness. They stressed that the vast bulk of Somali newcomers are law-abiding households who labor, remit levies, and give to academies, infirmaries, and neighborhood commerce. Federal bureaus repeated that sentiment. Penal liability is personal, and inquiries pursue proof rather than ethnicity. Nevertheless, the dispute expanded. Detractors challenged screening benchmarks and supervision after relocation. Defenders argued back that the malfunctions revealed by the lawsuit were organizational weaknesses, gaps that could be leveraged by anybody possessing access and endurance. The debate intensified when files demonstrated how valid initiatives and the vocabulary of civic duty had been utilized to cover illicit action. What disturbed legislators most was not where the accused originated, but how power had been utilized to mute inspection. Community centers became crowded. Mothers and fathers inquired how academies would be safeguarded. Educators inquired how archives could be believed once more. Migrant households fretted about disgrace and vengeance. The government reacted with regulatory suggestions, separate checks for restricted sections, tighter division between scholastic management and supply authorizations, and broadened defenses for those exposing truth. Federal organizations pledged to mixed assessment squads outside the standard line of authority to stop silent rigging. On television broadcasts and internet platforms, the argument grew noisier. Some presented the lawsuit as evidence of a shattered infrastructure. Others cautioned against turning fright into a weapon. Throughout everything, detectives continued laboring. Names were struck from charts. Fresh ones were highlighted. Proof kept appearing. Monetary connections, modified permissions, and synchronized timetables were found. The realities declined to align with easy stories. The governmental result was inevitable. Public trust had been rattled, and reconstructing it necessitated discipline just as much as determination. Chiefs who attempted to win tally marks found themselves questioned by checkers and statistics. Chiefs who concentrated on repairs discovered two-party backing for solid changes. The teaching traversed partisan boundaries. When organizations turn untransparent, responsibility crumbles and evil participants prosper. By the conclusion of the week, detentions had grown. Assessments were continuing. The migration argument remained fierce but more exact, fastened to regulation rather than hysteria. Federal bureaus repeated their position. Fairness would be chased without bias, and changes would be judged by results rather than titles. The lawsuit had laid bare something more profound than felony. It showed how rapidly public faith can break and how carefully it must be mended. The task ahead would be sluggish, debated, and observable. That was the objective, because in a republic, the toughest struggles are not merely against lawbreakers but against apathy. And the ultimate gauge of this probe would not be who was detained, but whether the infrastructure came out more robust, more just, and unable to be leveraged again. When the captures were finished and the proof safeguarded, detectives moved from policing to study. What appeared was not doubt but lucidity. Massive narcotic enterprises do not endure in pandemonium. They endure on permission. Every load, every diverted dossier, every skipped safety measure necessitated an endorsement. Not a theatrical endorsement, but a standard endorsement. Quiet autographs placed in average bureaus under average designations. These permissions adhered to a design. Assessments were scheduled to evade inspection. Exceptions were granted just soon enough to stop objection. Duty was split so no single workstation seemed crucial. This was not carelessness. It was organized, a framework crafted to guarantee that no single autograph appeared remarkable. Yet combined, they allowed remarkable injury. As this fact became open, faith started to decay. People no longer viewed documentation as safety. Sheets, imprints, and state crests ceased symbolizing security and started to symbolize peril. Records that formerly gave comfort now incited doubt. Power, when separated from responsibility, no longer sparked trust. It summoned skepticism. This collapse of faith did not come via hysteria. It came via realization that lawfulness can be utilized as disguise. That protocols can be rigged to protect misconduct. That quietness, when constructed into infrastructures, becomes just as perilous as brutality itself. The effect reached past Minnesota. The gears revealed in this lawsuit were not local. They were foundational. Any organization that depends on stratified permissions, restricted supervision, and automatic obedience can be leveraged in the identical manner. The prototype does not rely on location. It relies on intricacy and apathy. Where duty is watered down, responsibility fades. Where habits go unchallenged, misuse ensues. This lawsuit showed how narcotic webs adjust. Drugs no longer travel merely through darkness. They travel through datasheets. They conceal themselves behind managerial vocabulary. Brutality becomes scarce because obedience is more effective. Injury is dispensed without pandemonium, without sound, and frequently without instant perceptibility. The hazard resides not only in the narcotics themselves but in the standardization of procedure over wisdom. When velocity takes the place of inspection and faith takes the place of checking, organizations become prone to attack. Over time, that weakness solidifies into custom. The ultimate teaching is straightforward and inevitable. Infrastructures cannot be relied upon to guard themselves. Supervision must be vigorous, autonomous, and continuous. Openness cannot be a choice. Quietness cannot be compensated. When focus dims, mistreatment occupies the gap. This lawsuit did not finish with captures. It finished with revelation. Revelation of how simply power can be abused when left unscrutinized and how rapidly faith falls when lawfulness is confused with honesty. The caution is distinct. Narcotic webs prosper where supervision fades. Brutality ensues where quietness is mandated. And organizations only stay valid when responsibility is noisier than custom. This was not a deviation. It was a display. And what was displayed must not be disregarded. What this inquiry uncovered was not merely a felony but a teaching. A teaching concerning how simply faith can be abused when infrastructures are allowed to operate on custom instead of responsibility. Drugs did not travel through pandemonium. They traveled through custom. Injury did not arrive with cautionary signals. It arrived with endorsements, autographs, and quietness. The most perilous portion of this lawsuit was not the drugs, the cash, or even the brutality. It was how normal everything appeared. Bureaus operated, documents circulated, archives were imprinted and stored. And behind that facade of discipline, destruction expanded silently, impacting lives long before anybody observed. The teaching is distinct. Organizations are not robust because they are present. They are robust only when they are challenged. Supervision is not a hindrance. It is defense. And openness is not a choice. It is vital. This lawsuit did not finish with captures. It finished with revelation. Revelation of a framework that malfunctioned because focus dimmed. Revelation of how rapidly lawfulness can be confused with honesty. And revelation of what occurs when quietness is compensated instead of contested. The duty now reaches past detectives. It pertains to the populace. Knowledge is not skepticism. It is watchfulness. Being attentive is not lack of faith. It is civic obligation. If you think the populace has the privilege to learn how authority can be abused, press like so this narrative finds more individuals. If you think responsibility should never be a choice, write responsibility underneath. And if you think quietness is what permits infrastructures like this to endure, distribute this clip, because organizations do not guard themselves. Humans do. And the ultimate protection is not documentation. It is awareness.